This video is sponsored by the DC20 Kickstarter. What game will replace 5th edition? That's the question that our community has been struggling with ever since January of last year, when a lot of companies and content creators realized that D&D 5e might not remain the most beneficial TTRPG to hitch your wagon to indefinitely. Pretty soon, companies started launching their own original TTRPGs. Cobalt Press started developing Black Flag, which eventually became Tales of the Valiant. Critical Role started fleshing out their ideas for Daggerheart. MCDM started working on their own original RPG. And I would argue that none of these companies believed they would be able to carve out a significant chunk of Wizards of the Coast's marketing share. But instead, they just want to make a game that you want to play. Maybe that's not what the discourse always implies, but I'd imagine if you ask these creators, they're pretty realistic about how much of a market share they're going to wind up getting. Now, I've been keeping an eye on a bunch of these systems from afar, and I want to try a lot of them out once I have a little bit more free time, but I didn't know which one I wanted to try first. That is, until fellow YouTuber The Dungeon Coach reached out and asked if I'd be interested in checking out DC20, his own take on a D20-based adventure RPG. And to be honest, I wasn't sure I needed one of those right now. I figured we had enough floating around in the space already. But then I checked out DC20 and it rose way up the list of games I want to take for a spin. Now I want to be clear, I haven't gotten a chance to play this game yet. DC20 has been in alpha testing for a long time now, but I've not had the opportunity to play. And unfortunately, due to the genuine joys of being a parent, it's probably going to be a minute before I really get the chance to try this out at my table. But I can tell you how I feel based on the material I've read and the videos I've seen where the Dungeon Coach explains these systems. And I gotta tell you, I really like what I'm seeing so far. Now, the most obvious points of comparison to this game are 5th edition D&D and Pathfinder 2nd edition. This game starts with the bones of 5e and then builds onto that with mechanics that have a lot in common with Pathfinder 2. However, the Dungeon Coach didn't just drop a few Pathfinder rules into the game as is and call it a day. He developed this rule set through months of playtests, which I believe he handled himself, and I cannot imagine doing that. Seriously, good for him. But as a result, this game doesn't feel like a Frankenstein monster of a bunch of different systems. It actually does feel, to me, like what a 6th edition of D&D might look like. I think something like Tales of the Valiant is basically a 5.5 edition, trying to stick as close to 5e as they could so they don't have to throw out their whole product line. And obviously that's basically exactly what the designers at Wizards of the Coast have been trying to do as well, but it seems like they're trying to change even less. DC20 feels like the first game I've seen that is really trying to capture the same core fantasy as 5e, and trying to keep as many mechanics as possible, but is also totally unafraid to change things that the Dungeon Coach just felt brought 5e down. And because of that, I think you have a really strong game that I cannot wait to play because the game is built off of strong opinions about what makes 5e and Pathfinder work and where they both fall short. And we'll come back to the idea of an opinionated RPG later on because that really is DC20's strength. And spoiler alert, it's maybe what our hobby is finally ready for. Now, like I said earlier, I'm making this video to promote the DC20 Kickstarter, which is live right now, so this is a sponsored video. However, everything I'm going to say in this video is entirely my opinion. I wouldn't agree to take on a sponsor where I couldn't honestly give my thoughts. But if this game doesn't sound cool to you, then I do think you should check out the Kickstarter if it seems like it might be up your alley. And if you back the Kickstarter, you'll get some awesome stuff. Obviously, you get the core rulebook, which contains the entire game. It's not split into a player's handbook and a dungeon master's guide or anything like that. There's 12 classes, each of which has been reassessed, reapproached, and redesigned with a fresh take, and there are 3 unique and iconic subclasses for each class, so you'll get 36 total subclasses in this book. And as we'll discuss later in this video, character creation is so customizable and flexible, you truly have ultimate freedom to create exactly the character you want. There's also a social system and an exploration system, so you don't have to fumble your way through 2 underdeveloped pillars of the TTRPG experience. And every Kickstarter backer will get access to the DC20 beta immediately when the Kickstarter ends, so you can be involved in the process, offering feedback and helping to shape the future of this game. And if you sign up in the first 72 hours, you'll receive a bunch of free content, including a collection of DC20 one-shots, so you can start playing immediately, a collection of magic item rewards, and an advanced guide collection full of tips and tricks for new and experienced players and game masters. The Kickstarter went live today, it's live right now, so check out the link below and give it a look to see if it might be what you're looking for. And make sure to support it in the first 72 hours if you want all that awesome stuff I just mentioned. Thanks so much to the Dungeon Coach for sponsoring this video. Now, like I said, I haven't played this game yet, so this isn't going to be an incredibly deep dive into each of the mechanics. We're not going to talk about the classes individually, nothing like that. This game just finished its alpha testing and it's headed into beta testing now after the Kickstarter, so a lot of the specifics are potentially subject to change. And I'll definitely make more DC20 videos in the future, either during the beta testing or once the game is published. But what I do want to focus on the most today are the most interesting mechanics I've spotted, and I want to talk about why I like them or why I don't. I'll also talk about how these mechanics impact the game. Now, that's tough to say with any authority since I haven't played or run the game yet, but I think we can still see how these design choices reflect a specific design goal, and hopefully predict how they'll change the game in interesting ways. And I think we can see that in action, no pun intended, even though you wouldn't know that would be a pun for yet. But anyway, we'll see that in action with the first rule we're going to talk about today. The rule that is probably the most obvious starting point for any DC20 discussion, because it impacts basically every other design choice that followed. In DC20, you get 4 action points. Each action point allows you to move, attack, disarm, grapple, help, dodge, hide, that sort of thing. Now this is clearly reminiscent of Pathfinder's 3-action mechanic, which was Pathfinder's way of phasing bonus actions out of the game. However, in Pathfinder, you also get a single reaction. You can take that off of your turn. In DC20, you get 4 action points, and you can use as many of them as you want to take reactions outside of your turn. But that means once it comes around to your turn, you're down however many action points you spent on reactions. Your stockpile of 4 action points doesn't reset until the end of your turn. Now, even before we get to the different ways action points can be used, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, already I think we can see that having 4 actions that you can potentially spend on your turn is already going to make your heroes just a little bit more powerful than Pathfinder characters, and especially more powerful than level 1 D&D characters who don't even get multiple attacks yet. A D&D character also just has an action, movement, and potentially a bonus action on their turn if they have something, and if they don't, then their bonus action is wasted. So already it feels like DC20 is tilting a bit more toward heroic fantasy, where the heroes are more powerful early on. I haven't really sat down and figured out the math of DC20, but you do have much lower modifiers and damage rolls than D&D or Pathfinder, so it seems to me like it all balances out. Action points can also be spent to give yourself advantage on a roll, and we'll talk more about that in a second. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to how the game is dealing with advantage and disadvantage. But this is what I like about the action point system. It leans a lot into my style of play. I love telling my players, well, sure, you could try to do this, but you'll have to get something up for it. Sure, you can go into a range on someone else's turn, but you'll need to spend an inspiration. Sure, you can try to react to someone attacking your ally, even though that's not how reactions work, but let's say you have to give up your action surge to do it. I made a whole video about this in the early days of my channel, about how my style of play is all about letting players do cool stuff. But I don't just let them haggle and try to convince me that they should be able to do something cool, even though the rules say they can't do it, just because they really want to really badly. But instead, I basically set up a barter system with my players where they can try to do cool stuff, but they have to use some sort of resource to do so. Usually that's inspiration, since I give out inspiration a lot, specifically because I want my players to spend it to do cool stuff. But here, DC20 has built that system of negotiation and resource spending directly into the game. Like, I mean this sincerely. When I first saw that DC20 had this action point system and that it is a fairly flexible system that seems designed to encourage players to do badass stuff, I thought, holy crap, this system was made specifically for me. This speaks to exactly how I play my games. Now, you can't just do whatever you want with your reaction. There are conditions to each reaction that you have to meet, but the fact that you have this freedom to potentially take a bunch of reactions actually drastically changes the game. Games like D&D and DC20 are fundamentally resource management games. And when a resource management game is really cooking, when the gameplay is really working, the players have lots of things they want to do, but not enough actions or whatever to do them all. I think Ticket to Ride is a great example of that style of play. But a subset of that is the game where you have resources you can spend, but you have to be judicious about spending them so you don't run out before your turn comes around. Sure, you could play a card on somebody else's turn, but you don't draw back up to full until the end of your turn. So think carefully about how many cards you want to spend before your turn even gets here. And that's what I really like about the action point system. I am so glad the action points reset at the end of your turn rather than at the beginning. It would be so much less fun to try to save up your action points to potentially use as reactions. That's kind of the issue with readying an action in D&D. You're making a huge investment and hoping you'll get the opportunity to pay it off before your next turn. Otherwise, you kind of just wasted your turn. Instead, with this system, you can spend reactions when the circumstances arise, but you also have to think about how many action points you're going to need for your turn. If the situation unfolds in such a way where you can take multiple reactions, you don't want to spend so many action points that you won't be able to do anything when your turn actually arrives. But also, did you notice another way having action points you can spend on reactions already changes things? The Dungeon Coaches discussed how they make players more invested in the gameplay, so they're not mentally checking out in between turns, and that's cool and all. But also, I think the system encourages players to start thinking about their turn before it arrives, and that helps cut down on the moments where your turn comes up and players just get analysis paralysis, or you realize, oh, they didn't think about what they were going to do on their turn at all. Now, it is still possible for players to get analysis paralysis thanks to having 4 action points to spend, but my hope is that this will help players feel better prepared for their turns by thinking about their resources throughout the entire round, before their turn actually arrives. However, one of my concerns for the action point system comes from the GM side of things. I love the action point system for the freedom it gives players and for bringing one of my favorite forms of resource management into the game. However, a reasonable question is, how do you handle action points for monsters? After all, unlike a player, the GM is probably going to be handling a lot more than one character during any given combat, and so it's a lot harder to keep track of all their various action points. This is already an issue I have with legendary actions, and action points have the potential to make it a lot worse. And unfortunately, I don't think the game currently offers a satisfying answer, at least not one that I'd think I'd be happy with. When the Monster Guide PDF discusses this issue, it offers a few solutions. One, just don't give the enemies reactions, at least until you get more practice with the game. I think this is kind of a bad solution because you're probably more likely to have fewer monsters at lower levels than you are at higher levels, so it might actually be easier to track their action points when the game is lower level. The second solution, well actually the next few solutions, are just different ways to track action points. Tally marks, counting down with dice, tokens, beads, that kind of thing. And that's probably what I'll end up doing in my games. But I do think offering suggestions for ways to make something easier to track does kind of indicate that you know the system is too tough to track any other way. And so I'd argue maybe it's a bit more complicated than it might need to be. The third solution they offer is to pre-plan your monster's moves to focus on specific combos, so that way you don't have to worry about coming up with reactions for them in the moment, because you already know how they're going to spend all 4 of their action points once their turn arrives. This sounds like it would make some really compelling combats. That approach is kind of what drove the design of Flee Mortals for 5e. It's the idea of pre-planning what actions your monsters are going to take in advance so you have the most tactical fights possible. I think you could absolutely make a compelling case that you could have a great supplement of monsters that use all their action points on their turns for maneuvers and team attacks to help take some of the burden off the GM. But until a resource like that exists, I also think it's kind of daunting for GMs to have to do that to get the best use out of their monsters. It really adds to the prep time required for any combat session, it makes it almost impossible to improvise a satisfying combat, and it focuses the game towards a more tactical style when that might not be everyone's preferred experience. And the fourth potential solution is just to give monsters 3 action points and 1 reaction, which, again, is a decent stopgap, but it doesn't really solve the issue. I don't really know what the best solution is for this issue, but it is something that's going to demand more bookkeeping from the GM than they might have to do in other systems, which is something to keep in mind. That being said, I'm also optimistic that players having 4 action points will also encourage more mobility on the battlefield. This is a problem with D&D 5e. Characters often just get locked down in place and don't move, either because there's no mechanical advantage for doing so, or because they can't move without risking an attack of opportunity. In my Pathfinder game, none of the monsters have had any reactions since not all monsters get reactions, so the player characters tend to move forward, attack, and retreat. Though we've only played a few sessions, so that might be specific to how the players are reacting to my tactics. But the fact that the reactions are a totally different resource in DC20 will hopefully mean that players are encouraged to explore the space a little bit more, especially since the game kind of expects the GM not to use that many monster reactions at lower levels, which I think actually would help teach players that they can move around a lot more in this game than they could in 5e. Also, I mentioned earlier that you can use an action point to give yourself advantage on a roll. Having 4 gives you lots of options there. For example, let's say you have disadvantage. You could use an action point to make it a flat roll, and then another action point to give yourself advantage. And then another action point to give yourself double advantage, and use your final action point to make the roll. Yes, that's right, you can have multiple versions of advantage and disadvantage stack on top of each other. Also, all instances of advantage and disadvantage don't automatically cancel each other out, they're treated more like numerical modifiers. This means that if you have disadvantage for one reason and double advantage for another reason, then only one instance of each would cancel each other out and you'd still have advantage. This is such a funny mechanic, and I already know some folks might not like it, and I'll tell you why I think that's the case, and then I'll tell you why I do like it. See, the advantage and disadvantage system is probably the biggest innovation 5th edition made to D&D. It radically changed the gameplay, and it was basically designed to replace all the floating modifiers that were so common with the game prior to 5th edition. We can still see those modifiers in action in Pathfinder. In addition to whatever bonuses they typically add to a roll, circumstances and buff spells might grant a character some extra bonuses like a +2 and another +3 and then a +4, and the designers at 5e knew that some players lose track of the math when all these extra modifiers aren't anywhere to be found on their character sheets. And even when that's not the case, earlier editions of D&D were famously slow, and trying to remember all the floating modifiers didn't help things. So instead, in 5e, you just roll the dice twice and use the higher result. Mathematically, that's not too different from getting something like a +3 anyway, I think, so it does a decent job of substituting in for some of the floating modifiers. And no D&D 5e game was ever slow again. However, if we look at DC20, if we assume each instance of advantage gives you roughly the equivalent of a +3, this does mean that having double and triple advantage messes with the math quite a bit. The end result is a game that has the potential to be a lot more swingy. And also, considering you still have to keep track of all these different floating add-ons, remembering how many advantages and disadvantages you have, how much easier is it than actually using floating modifiers? Plus, there are still some floating modifiers in this game too, so having advantage or disadvantage no longer replaces those numbers. And if that's your reaction to this rule, then I get it. However, I still like it because I run a lot of games for new players, and new players like rolling dice. If they get advantage from 2 different sources, then they'll get excited and they'll ask, Oh, does that mean I get to roll 3 dice now and take the highest of all 3? I mean, you tell them that it doesn't because any amount of advantage and disadvantage don't stack, and advantage and disadvantage cancel each other out no matter how many sources give you advantage. The new player will nod and understand, like, they'll get that this is meant to balance the game. But I do think it'll be fun to say, yeah, it actually does mean you get to roll 3 dice and take the highest. I don't know yet how it will actually feel and how it'll impact the game, and that's something I'm going to be definitely keeping an eye on once I finally get the chance to play the game. But my initial reaction is that this sounds fun, and right now, that's really exciting. It also pretty much guarantees that you can use your action points for something on every turn, because if you don't, then you can't just attack endlessly and have a chance of succeeding. Let me explain. See, in Pathfinder 2, you get a -5 to each subsequent attack you take, so you don't just sit and make 3 attacks in a row, you're pushed to do something else with your actions. DC20 similarly has a mechanic to push you out of that sort of behavior. Every attack adds another level of disadvantage. So if you attack 4 times, then you'll roll normal for the first attack, disadvantage for the second attack, double disadvantage for the third attack, and triple disadvantage for the fourth attack. Come to think of it, this is probably actually the reason the game throws out the idea of advantage and disadvantage canceling each other out and not being able to stack, so that there's an easy penalty to track each subsequent attack that you make. But yeah, this does seem like it'll help disincentivize someone from just sitting in place and attacking 4 times. You'd be rolling 10 dice across the span of your turn and only getting to keep 4 of the lowest results. So I think it's fair to assume that you'd start asking yourself, hey, what else could I be doing with my turn so I don't have to keep just doing this the whole time? And also, this kind of solves the problem with inspiration in 5e. You know, sometimes I feel like I'm the only GM left in the world who really uses inspiration, and that feeling wasn't helped by the fact that the D&D playtest shows that the designers didn't have any idea for what they wanted inspiration to even be. They knew they wanted it in the game, for some reason, but they didn't seem to know what role it should serve or what behavior it should reward. But you know, it's interesting. Inspiration as a mechanic is meant for players to give themselves advantage before an important role. But now anybody can do that as long as they have the action points to spend. And because that's the case, you're actually taking the pressure off yourself to worry about how much to assign inspiration. Also, you know how at so many tables, groups just house rule inspiration to act as a reroll instead of acting as a way to give yourself advantage before a roll? Well, in this case, the game actually removes that as an issue because that's not how the action points work. But also, you get so many action points, do you even need a reroll mechanic anymore? I don't think you do. Now, I also want to run through some interesting character options available to the players. First of all, the game only has 4 attributes: might, agility, intelligence, and charisma. Right now, we're in an era where lots of games are trying out different names for abilities, and if you're going to combine wisdom and intelligence into one skill, which is what this game does, I think intelligence is a fine name for it, I suppose, since you can't separate them into knowledge and instinct like Daggerheart does. And of course, like so many games besides D&D, DC20 has eliminated ability scores and left only ability modifiers. Although the game actually offers multiple ways to generate those numbers, which I love. I like that there's a way to roll to figure out these modifiers without having to go through a whole chart to help you get the number that you actually need when you play the game. You just roll a d6 minus 3, roll that 4 times, and you can add 2 points wherever you'd like as long as none of those results get higher than 3. That's really smart. And as someone who doesn't like using point buy or standard array for my characters, I felt that absence when making characters for Pathfinder or Daggerheart. And so it's really nice getting it back for this game. It's my second favorite part about DC20's character creation. But what's my favorite? Well, here's my favorite thing about making characters for this game. You can decide which attribute is the primary one you're going to use for your class. For example, obviously you can use might for your fighter and just be a big, beefy, hit things guy. Or you can be an agility-based fighter and be more of an Errol Flynn type. But you can also choose to be an intelligence-based fighter, someone who sizes up the battlefield or reads your opponent before you strike, like Sherlock Holmes in the one memorable scene from that movie. Or, if you needed any clear indication that this game was specifically made for me, Mike Christensen, you could make a charisma-based fighter. And as someone who once played a Minotaur fighter named Maku the Gregarious, and who sometimes just wants to play a bard when I really want to play a wizard just with high charisma, yeah, this level of flexibility sounds fantastic. Even without getting into the subclasses, even without comparing different classes, we can already see how the most basic version of the game is inviting you to be really creative with your character concept right off the bat. Even before factoring in the different powers and the way they take their maneuvers, it seems like every fighter and wizard has the potential to feel very different at the table. Now, spellcasting works a little bit differently in this game as well. There's a mana point system, and I know a lot of people like mana pools when they don't like spell slots, and I can't speak to how a lot of those other games usually work, but in this case, the design goal is to give the player flexibility and freedom to adjust their spells every time they cast them. Again, I talked before about how I'm often willing to negotiate with my players and allow spells to be cast in cool and creative and non-standard ways, but in this case, the designers want to give that power to the players right at the outset. And so once again, it removes the issue of having to negotiate to make something happen, and just gives the players a framework they can use to properly play in the space. But not to be left out, Martial characters also have a similar resource called stamina points. They don't have as many stamina points as the spellcasters have mana points, although it recharges on certain conditional effects, but this still gives them a resource they can use in combat to exercise their creativity and do cool maneuvers. There's one more option that's available to players that I want to talk about today. It's called still being able to play the game even when you're dying. When you drop to 0 hit points, you gain a level of exhaustion and you're limited to 1 action point every turn until you heal or die. You also can't concentrate on anything and you still make death saves, only now you make them at the end of your turn. This is a really solid approach to fixing the way 5e handles death. It's one thing to have to sit and wait patiently when your character dies, but a lot of the time, players also have to sit and wait when their character gets knocked out because they can't do very much when they're down. Even when they've rolled successful death saving throws or otherwise been stabilized, they still just have to sit and wait until a few hours have passed in the world of the game, and who knows how long that's going to take. But here, the players can still be involved. What does it look like when you're only at 1 action point? Are you bleeding and dragging yourself around the battlefield? Are you lying on the ground and taking a few shots with what little energy you have left? Are you calling out suggestions to your friends and trying to help them out? Whatever it is, you're still doing something. You're still playing the game. And that honestly makes a world of difference in giving players a better experience. Ever since the OGL scandal rocked the hobby early last year, there's been a push and pull around the new games in development. Obviously, the big talking point is which game has the potential to overthrow D&D as the biggest name in the game, and the counterpoint is people pointing out how that's never going to happen. But then, whenever one of these games does start disclosing some of its features and some of its rules, it gains some big fans and loses some others, as people realize what the game actually is and decide whether or not it's for them. And in some corners of this discourse, that's viewed as a bad thing. Because this game isn't more crunchy, it's going to lose the 5e fans who like the crunch. Because this game has strict rules, it's going to lose the 5e fans who enjoy the more freeform style of play. The comparison is made to Fantasy Heartbreakers, the very specifically individualized role-playing games made by designers in their garage who ultimately failed to find an audience because nobody else is looking for anything as niche as what they wanted to do with the game. But DC20 is a very opinionated game. It has clear ideas about what makes 5e fun, what makes Pathfinder fun, and what drags those games down. And because of that, it has very clear design goals, and we can see exactly how it's trying to accomplish those goals and decide for ourselves how successful it is at achieving them. Compare that with the new version of D&D, which throughout the playtesting process, I have been so frustrated that the creators really didn't give us a clear sense of what they were trying to accomplish with the game. We got specific notes about how they wanted to improve the play experience for certain classes, and that's not nothing, but what do they want the game to be? Do they want it to be more heroic fantasy or more deadly and gritty? It's really tough to judge how well the game is accomplishing its design goals when we don't know what it is they're trying to do. Maybe it'll still be a great game, I sure hope it is, but we can't necessarily tell that yet because we don't know what they're trying to make. I am so glad we're getting games like DC20, which are very specifically not right for every group, but they are perfect for some groups. I now know that once I'm able to start carving out time for more games, I really want DC20 to be on that list of games because a lot of what it's trying to do seems to be exactly what I want from TTRPGs as well. DC20 may not solve some of the issues you grapple with in your 5e games, but it seems to be designed to specifically target some of the moments of friction I've experienced in my games, and I am so excited to take it for a spin once I get the chance. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this sounds cool to you, and if you'll consider checking it out, because it might just be right up your alley. And spread the word, send this video around, let people know about this game, and let them decide whether or not it sounds like it might be right for them as well. And while you're sharing this video around, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I've got some really cool videos cooking right now, and I cannot wait for you to see them. Check out my Patreon or my YouTube memberships or my Ko-fi. Come hang out on my Discord server and sign up for my newsletter. All those links are in the doobly-doo below. Click here for a video about the weird D&D book cover discourse. That got very strange, so I made a really fun video about it, and I hope you check it out. Until next time, play fair and have fun.